is Ken Jensen, and I am a senior associate scholar with the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. And we've developed this project. It's taken a couple of years to really get it going, to look at cyber questions, just generally speaking, and trying to be as timely as possible. And now that's even more difficult than it has been, and cyber's been a hot topic for quite a long time now. When I woke up this morning, I thought, oh, there's no negative cyber news today. And then a friend of mine sent me this. The US and UK law enforcement officials yet Thursday announced charges against 2 Russians allegedly responsible for what the DOJ deemed 2 of the worst computer hacking and bank fraud schemes of the past decade. The unsealed computer hacking and bank fraud charges blame Maxim Yakubets and Igor Torshov for deployment of the Zeus and Bogat/Dridex malware, with Zeus estimated to have caused $70 million in bank account losses and another $220 million attempted. And Bogat is likely responsible for millions of losses. Well, yesterday may have been a rare day in cyber news, but today certainly isn't. The purpose of these events is to try to bring some kind of priority to cyber concerns. And the reason why I gave the event this title is because, and led with the term national security, is that I wanted to see what our distinguished panel would say about what I call the traditional national security issues. This doesn't necessarily mean, military issues and infrastructure safety and other things like that, but rather what we mean to do is to look at the difficulties that obtain and areas that are underserved, and I think our panel reflects this. I'm sorry to say that we lost Samantha Ravich from this panel. I will tell you that she is now sitting as vice chair of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, and they called a meeting today, and so she's not going to be with us. But what I intend to do after this event is to gather together what I think are a set of important articles that seem to me to, well, they reflect my biases, and I don't want to inflict my biases on the panel. But at any rate, these I will send out to those of you who've come here today, and we'll see what FPRI does with pushing this project along. But the idea is to try to isolate 3 or 4 key issues, and then there will be later events to pick up on that, on those conclusions. I don't know how many of you looked at the invitation or saw the invitation that we sent out. I'm going to introduce the panelists in order of their speaking, and Michelle Van Cleave offered kindly to be first. Michelle Van Cleave was the first person to serve as a statutory head of U.S. Counterintelligence. She's a nationally recognized authority on counterintelligence, homeland defense policy, and the security disciplines. She served in senior government positions for 3 U.S. presidents. She's also served, and also she served 3 congressional committees with responsibilities spanning intelligence, national defense, homeland security, and science and technology policy. A lawyer and consultant in private life, she is currently a principal at the Jack Kemp Foundation, helping to establish and manage programs to develop, engage, and recognize exceptional leaders. And with that, please.
Well, thank you, Ken. As I was saying to Ken, walking in this room, this is old home week for me because Jack Kemp's office was directly across the hall when I was working for him here in the 80s, so it feels very warm and comfortable to be here. I'm also grateful for the opportunity to speak on a panel that's looking at a range of cyber concerns, because Ken started iterating them, and you can add your own, but there, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. And when it came time for me to decide what I wanted to present to you, rather than trying to go down a long list, I decided to take one issue and to speak to that, and hopefully this helps advance the project, Ken, as you're collecting different concerns to raise in the context of what cyber has meant to our national security needs. I would say, from the standpoint of U.S. counterintelligence, which, as Ken mentioned, I had the great privilege of serving as the head of U.S. counterintelligence under President George W. Bush. From my perspective, the U.S. counterintelligence enterprise has not kept pace with the threat. The modalities and the vulnerabilities that are enabled by the information revolution, and I would say its evil twin, the disinformation revolution, have made the price that we pay for inadequate counterintelligence painfully high. Now, historically, counterintelligence has been a disjointed enterprise, divided among different departments and agencies with discrete and very important missions. And you can think of them. The FBI, far and away, has the largest CI responsibilities. It's a simplistic description, but find the spies, put them in jail. That's what we want the FBI to do, and it does that well. CIA has counterintelligence responsibilities to protect the mission that it conducts on our behalf, looking for important human insights into threats and opportunities. And their operations in the field need to be protected against the services that would disrupt our CIA operations. That's their CI, counterintelligence mission. The military services each have their own counterintelligence responsibilities and entities that look after the force protection and operations protection against foreign threats. Each of these is very important, and there is strength. The United States has great strength in the diversity of skills that are represented across those very different agencies, the way they're trained, the way they're recruited, the things they do. But what has been missing? What has been missing, continues to be missing, before and after cyberspace reshaped our world, is an integrated, nationally directed strategic program to identify foreign intelligence threats, find their vulnerabilities, proactively disrupt and neutralize their operations. This is what I want to concentrate on. I'd like to spend this time talking about these foreign intelligence threats to the U.S., how cyber has exacerbated the challenges to U.S. counterintelligence, and the set of things we do to try to counter those threats, and what needs to be done now. I actually have some ideas I'd like to throw out for your consideration. So as you know, foreign adversaries use their intelligence services their intelligence capabilities as a strategic make-weight, where they're behind their intelligence are used in ways to give them advantage. They look for insights that can give them advantage. They're targeting sensitive technologies. They employ human services. Make this little mental note. They employ human services to asymmetric advantage. What do I mean by that? If we're ahead in science and technology in the ways that we operate, they recognize that human activities, human penetrations are an old standard, always works, and they expend a lot of time and energy on human operations. I would dare say more than we do, because it is a less expensive way of going, and it's got a lot of return. And of course, they're exploiting cyber operations and targets and vulnerabilities of cyberspace. And they're using the strength of our democracy against us. They look for vulnerabilities, and one of those vulnerabilities is inherent in what we cherish most: the openness of our society, the free exchange of ideas, public debate, the faith in citizens in the institutions of our democracy, that they work for us. So the foreign intelligence activities are directed against this set of targets to penetrate, collect, and compromise our national security secrets, including sensitive information, sensitive technologies, and to manipulate and distort the perception of reality of our U.S. decision makers. How do they do that? Well, they try to corrupt the intelligence that we're collecting against them, and they try to mislead us by conducting covert influence operations. And keep in mind that in a democracy, the ultimate decision maker is who? The public. It is the citizens. And cyber introduces a new calculation into these traditional activities, new operational modalities, a new playing field, and new attack vectors, as well as new vulnerabilities. Also, a key point to keep in mind is this: cyber espionage business and the human espionage business go hand in hand. Access is always the key. Access to computer systems that may enable the implanting of the next nasty bug. Access to information about individuals that may prove compromising or otherwise useful to a resourceful intelligence service. Tricking somebody into letting you into a system may be far easier and more effective than searching for hidden vulnerabilities to exploit. And it is the marriage of cyber and human espionage that is the most effective tool in the arsenal of our adversaries. So take, for example, China. China has a national policy of economic espionage in cyberspace. We are witnessing, as I think it was Keith Alexander said, the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. And I'm going to lay that one on the table, and I expect that some of my colleagues are going to take up this theme. But I'm going to turn to something about China that is, we know, but we don't think about very much. You may recall that back in 2015, there was a hack over a sustained period into the OPM database. And data on 22 million current users, current and former federal employees, rather, roughly 7% of the US population was sucked in by the Chinese. How many here hold security clearances? Anybody? All of us on the panel, just about to, okay, some out in there. Well, you know what goes into those files. All kinds of incredibly sensitive information about you, your bank records, where you've lived, your close associates, all the jobs that you've held, the places that you have visited, where you've had to report on those things, your doctor's records, where have you gone for counseling, where have you gone for psychoanalysis, where the kinds of things that you have done also that you're not eager to have anyone know about? Do you have any kind of a police record that's going to be in there? Have you had an embarrassing confrontation with your neighbor that's on record someplace, and when they go in to talk to your neighbor says, yeah, that guy, on and on and on. These things are all in those records. So why do the Chinese want them? What do they do with all of this stuff? Well, in the espionage business, spotting and assessing vulnerable individuals are the first steps in developing new sources or recruiting new assets. Identify who has access to sensitive information is step one, and finding their vulnerabilities is step two. So with these incredible records from OPM, built on top of other things the Chinese have collected from other vast databases like health insurance records and credit card information and, oh, by the way, tapping into other government records. Pulling all of this together, the Chinese now have a detailed roster of most, if not all, American contractors and government employees have access to classified information. So that's step one, check. They also have a treasure trove of data that can be used to coerce or blackmail or recruit U.S. persons. One-stop shopping for step 2, but it doesn't even end there. Since these files also include records of where U.S. officials have lived, where they have traveled abroad, contact reports on foreign individuals, they've got all that information too. Such details could help a foreign service piece together U.S. intelligence networks and operations and develop a blueprint for disrupting them. Now, perhaps you saw press reports that CIA pulled a number of officers from the American embassy in Beijing as a precautionary measure after the OPM breach. And other news reports suggest that there was a clandestine network of engineers and scientists who provide technical assistance who were also potentially compromised, and so their operations had to be shut down. And of course, since these databases are so comprehensive, they are in a sense a gift that keeps on giving. So, of course, in a democracy, again, as I said a moment ago, the ultimate decision maker is the American public. It is the public. And I want to turn then, in the time I have, to tell you a bit about Russian influence operations, which is not something that is not discussed in this body. Now, for the Russian security services, they've had a long history of manipulating information as a weapon. Active measures, perhaps you know the term, active measures, that refers to direct intervention by clandestine means in the politics of another country. The objective is to influence events through front groups, forgeries, false conspiracies, agents of influence, and disinformation campaigns. Disinformation operations aim at manipulating the opinion-making process and undermining confidence in our leaders and in our institutions, and exploiting existing vulnerabilities in society to confuse and divide and subvert and inflame and paralyze. Now, again, nothing new to the Russians to engage in influence operations, and those of you who may be students of what the Russians did historically will recall that claiming AIDS was a weapon invented by CIA was a big theme that they put out. They claimed that U.S. used chemical weapons in the Korean War. Not true. They attempted to smear the presidential candidacy of Barry Goldwater as a racist. They blamed the U.S. for the assassination attempt on the Pope. They blamed the U.S. for a coup against de Gaulle. They forged letters from the Ku Klux Klan threatening African country representatives to the Summer Olympics, and on and on and on and on and on. Back then, during the Cold War, there was, back in 1983, when I was working across the hall, there was a body that the Reagan administration had. There was an active measures working group that I looked at all of these things and exposed them and worked against them to bring forward the truth. And I think it's interesting historically to look at what the former director, Ambassador Cooks, K-U-X, was that his name? You call Cooks, said back then about these activities. Just listen to this. So disinformation appears to fare poorly in Western democracies with their free press. With a few exceptions, disinformation has largely surfaced either in sensationalist or pro-communist journals where it has little impact on public opinion. Reasonable journalists and journals check out suspicious-sounding allegations or anonymous documents. They do not generally publish stories lacking evidence and sourcing. Well, my, how things change. What's novel now is that the digital era has afforded the Kremlin and other state and non-state actors new tools in these efforts. Trolls, bots, deep fakes, and 1,000 other things that I'm not aware of, and they're coming around the corner soon. The Russian government, of course, has set up factories of people whose job it is day in and day out to churn out as much muck as possible, push it out into Western information channels, and try to influence unsuspecting minds, not only here, but in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, in Western Europe, in Africa, around the world, where they have interests in wanting to sow discord. And the false stories come out faster than the old ones can be debunked. So it's an impossible cycle to keep up with. Frankly, we're just not sure quite how to respond to all of this, in my opinion. Maybe there are brilliant people here, I hope there are, who have great ideas on how to deal with all of this, but I think we're very, very much in the, oh my deer in the headlights mode right now. What do we do? Meanwhile, Moscow's understanding of our politics is very well tuned, very well refined. They've been studying us like crazy for the past 30 years because we remain their central focus, even though after the Cold War, we turned our efforts elsewhere. We do have terrorist organizations that we're very concerned about. Our intelligence efforts got rooted there. And plus, we thought, the Cold War was over. We don't have to worry about the Russians so much. So there was a reorientation away from Russia, and the Russians did not reciprocate in turning away from their interests in us. So these disinformation campaigns have long-standing strategic objectives to subordinate the near abroad, Eastern and Central Europe, under their control, to undermine NATO. We look at the S-400 sales to Turkey as an example that support these larger disinformation activities, and to divide the United States within us against ourselves. But unlike the Soviet days, where the big objective was to try to promote their ideology, communist ideology, the strategic objective today is to undermine Western ideals. Politicians are corrupt. The media can't be trusted. No one gets a fair shake. Democracy doesn't work. The stories don't have to be consistent. They just have to be repeated enough so that responsible people start to believe them. Now, the Russian security services didn't create this toxic environment or deep distrust of the government in the United States, but they are exploiting that climate of political dysfunction by turning the strengths of an open and democratic and technologically advanced country into weaknesses. I think there's a great danger in democracy. People, if we lose our trust in government, if we lose confidence that the government represents our interests, it really undermines the core of what makes our nation distinctive and whole and free. And was there ever a more brilliant opening for foreign influence to undermine and destroy what makes America great, and the covenant that we have, the government exists to secure the rights of each individual. So, what to do? What to do? I have to say there's good news coming out of the fact that 2016 elections are front and center still with respect to Russian influence operations. From my perspective, the good news is that they have brought these questions into the public debate. I mean, these activities on behalf of the Russians they're not something that are unknown, or other influencers such as the Chinese. It's not unknown. They've been going on for quite a while, but we haven't really had the public focus on this. So when this happened, I thought, great, now we're going to finally have some attention paid to what needs to be done about U.S. counterintelligence. And yet, you can search through the voluminous testimony on the 2016 presidential elections, the open hearings of the intelligence committees on both sides of this hill, or any of the legislation proposed, and you will not find any serious congressional inquiry into the basic question, does the federal government have the capabilities it needs to identify, assess, and defeat these hostile threats to the United States? In fact, it's been 17 years since Congress has taken a serious look at this subject. So I do have a way forward to propose, but I might just lay out those concerns and hold my way forward for later comment.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. We'll just go right down the table. I had originally envisioned that there would be commentary between the presentations, but I think we'll get around to enough commentary as it is. Let me introduce to you Stewart Baker. Stewart Baker's career has spanned national security and law. He served as General Counsel of the National Security Agency, Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security, and a drafter of a report reforming the intelligence community after the Iraq War. His legal practice focuses on cybersecurity, export controls, government procurement, and immigration and regulation of international travel. I would also say that the first of these Hill meetings that I did back in 2012, Stewart was a participant, and we had, I think, a very good time then. The world has changed a great deal, but Stewart Baker has kept up with it.
Cyber Law podcast, and if you have not subscribed to that, I'm going to take advantage of my position here and say you are impeached. Let me just go through a laundry list of topics that I think are going to be part of our national security agenda for the next several years. But I'll start with the first one, which is going to be part of the national security agenda for the next several weeks, which is we have to reauthorize all of the FISA surveillance authorities that are now due to expire March 15. They were due to expire December 15, and the can was kicked down the road on the assumption, apparently, that March will be a less political season than December. I think that's improbable. And frankly, I think it's time to say that sunsetting critical national security surveillance capabilities is an idea whose time is totally past. The idea that we would say, oh yeah, every 5 years we'll bet that our national security can depend on the administration and the Congress and both parties getting together in a spirit of bipartisanship and national interest and doing what's good for the country without trying to extract some last-minute partisan advantage on holding up a bill, potentially causing it to fail and the authorities to expire. That idea was implausible even after 9/11, but it is totally out of whack with today's realities. And the idea that this kind of authority, alone among the authorities that govern our behavior in the Republic, should depend on that happening every 5 years is nuts. And so I think it's time to get rid of the sunsets entirely. Probably a good idea to do some reform focused on how to make sure that FISA and our intelligence capabilities are not used in a partisan way. Whatever you think about what happened in 2016, the risk was there that the intelligence authorities could have been used to accomplish political ends, and we may or may not think we escaped without that happening, but it's a good idea to ask, what could we do to make sure it doesn't happen next time? So I would be happy to reopen some of the FISA authorities, but we need to pass them by March 15, and then we need to end the requirement that they sunset. Second big issue, this one will last us a decade or more, and that is the project that the Trump administration has initiated and that any Democratic or Republican administration that follows President Trump will continue, and that is the great economic and national security decoupling with China's economy with respect to technology in particular. We cannot continue to simply let the market determine which technologies are made and developed in the United States and which remain with China, because China has a very clear vision of where it's going to go with technological development, and it's going to put the very substantial power of its state behind that vision. And while our technology sector is vibrant and strong, it cannot compete against the power of a state as large as China, and particularly when China has the ability to say, not only are we going to give money to our companies, but we're going to give them a protected market where Facebook and Google and Intel cannot go. And when that happens, that means that anybody who develops technology has a guaranteed 1.3 billion person market where they can fight off other domestic competitors, become dominant in China, and then say, look around the rest of the world and say, I think I can take those guys, and they might well be able to do that. So the U.S. is going to need more than just faith in the free market to respond to this challenge. I don't think we have a choice about this because China has already made up its mind where it's going here. It is determined to never again depend on U.S. technology because they never again want to be where ZTE in particular and Huawei and some of their other companies are now, which is unable to sell products that contain U.S. content. It's not perfectly true, but they can see that condition from here. It would put them out of business in many cases. They don't want to do that. They have to have a domestic alternative, which means that there is an enormous U.S.-made incentive for the Chinese to develop a capability to generate all of the products that the U.S. is very proud to lead the world with. And we're going to have to respond to that by making sure that we don't inadvertently lose commercial capabilities that our military depends on, which would open us up to all kinds of espionage risks and military risks as well. So that is the project of the decade, I believe, and how we manage that will determine whether this is a second American century or a Chinese century. Third topic that I would identify is intermediate but very real, and it's driven by new technology trends, and that is the remarkable degree to which we have, without even noticing it, become subject to the content preferences of governments around the world. We heard a lot about disinformation, and that is certainly the case. But the Russians, you know, they believe in active measures. I characterized them once on the podcast as having, the GRU has an internal culture that could be summed up as, yo, Boris, hold my beer and watch this. They'll do anything, and they're happy to do anything. They don't mind getting caught. They do you the favor of being in your face with it and unrepentant. And the Chinese are far less so and far more powerful in what they do. But they certainly control the content that is made available inside China. And the story of the last 10 years has been authoritarian governments first learning to control the impact of the new technologies that we help to roll out. And then, having figured out how to do that, exporting those capabilities to countries that are like-minded, like Turkey, or to countries that would just as soon they butt it out, like ours. Now, today, if you go to a U.S. website run by Baidu and you look up Tiananmen Square, 1989, you will see pretty tourist pictures of things that might have happened in Tiananmen Square and maybe happened in June of 1989, but probably didn't. And you won't see a lot of references to the bloodbath because Baidu is subject to discipline of the Chinese government. They were sued for that, for refusing to provide that information. And what do you think they said? They said, we have a First Amendment right not to talk about that. And that is, the fact is the First Amendment is a unique handicap for the United States that does not apply to any other government. Every other government in the world would like to control what Americans can read, and most of them are starting to get a little bit of a handhold on that. You saw what happened when one guy in the NBA said the wrong thing, and he'll never say that again, and neither will anybody else in the NBA. There's a lot of lessons being learned by American institutions that what they say is not something that the U.S. government can punish them for. They can kneel all they want during the U.S. anthem. I bet they don't do that to the Chinese anthem when they're playing there, because the consequences are substantially greater. And as a result, there is a one-sided dialogue in which U.S. views are distinctly underrepresented and often punished. Even the European Union, which is, often our friend, is enthusiastic about regulating speech in ways that would never be allowed in the United States. They recently, this is kind of an astonishing case in which a German guy got on a yacht, crossed the Atlantic halfway, and then got in a fight with his yacht mates, killed 2 of them and wounded the 3rd, went to jail for 20 years, came out, and sued, claiming that European privacy law allowed him to have all those records expunged and to prevent the public from reading about the murder that was covered in The Guardian at considerable length. And the German court said, yeah, that sounds right to us. And in other contexts, similar rulings have been applied, such as libel cases where somebody called the Green Party a proto-fascist party in a context where they were trying to squelch speech. Maybe right. And the Austrian court said, that's libelous. You can't say that about them, and Facebook and Google are going to have to take that down worldwide. Nobody is allowed to hear that description of a Green Party official. So even the Europeans are telling our social media what they can and cannot allow Americans to read. We need to deal with that issue. We need to find a way to make sure that the values of free expression are not killed off by the First Amendment and are not killed off by foreign governments acting in a fashion that the U.S. government is constitutionally prohibited from acting. Cyber defense and resilience, we are failing, and we're not failing as bad, but and I think increasingly there is some reason to think it's possible to defend our cyber systems, but it is so expensive and so difficult and so demanding from every single day that very few companies have done it. And we're clearly going to have to do a much better job there of finding people who actually have succeeded in keeping intruders out of their system and making sure that our military, our government systems are as well protected as those are, and that systems that don't have a lot of money, like our dams and sewage systems, are equally well protected. And then last, I continue to believe that encryption is going to be an issue that we cannot simply leave to the companies. right now, we have basically created a situation in which the FBI just has to take whatever the companies have designed into their system, and we've created incentives for companies to design systems in which it is impossible for them to give the FBI any help whatsoever. That is the goal of the engineering processes that are underway in Silicon Valley today, and they've already cut off content, and I think that it is their goal to cut off metadata access as well. The Attorney General gave a speech in which he said, no one has contradicted him, that WhatsApp groups were used by cartel members in Mexico to create Mexican narcotics police hunting units so that they could identify and kill hundreds of Mexican police. There are hundreds of Mexican police widows today who were made widows with the extraordinary assistance and superb security provided by WhatsApp groups. That's a deeply troubling thing. If Elon Musk said, here's an autonomous vehicle, and it killed 300 people, and he said, yeah, but on average, it's really cool, I don't think we would say, yeah, okay, fine, that's just on them. At a minimum, we would say, well, what are we going to do about those widows, and how are we going to compensate them? You're making all the money off of the products that you're selling. Why aren't you also charging the true social costs of your products? So my guess is that this debate is not over, and that at a minimum, whether the Silicon Valley companies want to build in access or not, they're going to have to pay the consequences of not providing help to law enforcement. So that's controversial enough, I hope.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you very much. We'll move on to Jamil Jaffer, and he can correct me if I get some of this wrong, but he's currently assistant professor of law and founder and executive director of the National Security Law and Policy Program at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. At George Mason, he teaches classes on counterterrorism, intelligence, surveillance, cybersecurity, and other national security matters, as well as a summer course in Padua, Italy, with U.S. Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. And I have a connection with Gorsuch, which I'm going to discuss with Jamil at a later time. Professor Jaffer is also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and is affiliated with Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. He is also currently Vice President for Strategy and Partnerships at IronNet Cybersecurity, a startup technology firm founded by former NSA Director Keith Alexander. With that,
thanks. No, thanks, Ken. Appreciate you having me. And I'm really glad that Stewart went right before me, because I was about to say that I agreed with everything that Michelle said and everything that Stewart said, but right at the end, I heard you calling for some sort of a tax on Tesla vehicles to make up for the social ills they cause, and not sure I'm going to agree with that, but the rest of it I agree with. But listen, in all seriousness, I think that all of the issues that Michelle raised about Russian covert influence and overt active measures are hugely problematic. It's a massive issue. The counterintelligence problems posed by China's acquisition of the OPM database will certainly empower human intelligence operations for decades, if not a century, and hugely problematic. All the issues that Stewart raised are really important, and I agree with 100%. I'm just going to pick one of those issues, Stewart, and the one I think you spent the least time on, and dive a little deeper on that, which is this issue of cybersecurity and our ability to defend our nation and defend our own infrastructure and our economy when it comes to the cyber realm. And I know Michelle touched on this a little bit also. one of the very odd things about cybersecurity, is that in the traditional context, we talk about national security issues and threats posed by nation states to our citizens and our companies. We generally assume the government's job is to defend the nation, right? And so when it comes to Target and Walmart, we don't expect Target or Walmart or Citibank or JP Morgan to defend against Russian bear bombers or to have surface-to-air missiles on the roof of their buildings to defend against the Russian threat. And that's obvious because nobody could buy that capability. It wouldn't make sense to have them have that capability. We do expect them to have armed guards and dogs and high fences to defend against the typical threats that companies might face, but we don't expect them to defend against the nation-state threat. And yet in cyberspace, the theory is exactly the opposite. We expect every single company in this country, no matter whether small, medium, or large, to defend not just against script kiddies with hacking in their basement or criminal hacker gangs, but we expect them to defend against the Russian nation state, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians. And of course that makes no sense because unlike the script kiddie and unlike even criminal hacker gangs, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and North Koreans have virtually unlimited capital and unlimited human resources to throw at the problem. And of course, Walmart and Target and Citibank and JP Morgan are not in the business of cyber defense. They're in the business of providing capital or providing goods and services to Americans and citizens and individuals around the globe. And so it's not shocking that they're not capable of defending themselves. And yet, the US government isn't capable or authorized or funded to do that defense. Notwithstanding the fact that in 2012, Leon Panetta told us that it is the role and responsibility of the Department of Defense to defend the nation's cyberspace, and that we created an entire entity, US Cyber Command, that my current boss, General Keith Alexander, was a founding commander of. We've never resourced Cyber Command to do that defense of the nation capability. We've never given them the authority to do that. And yet, that is the traditional expectation of the nation state. Now, it may very well be the case that we don't want Cyber Command or DoD or NSA to defend the nation in cyberspace, because even if we could identify the borders of the U.S. internet, which we can't, that it wouldn't make sense from a public policy, a privacy, a civil liberties perspective. You might not want NSA and Cyber Command policing the boundaries of the internet to defend the nation. So maybe it doesn't make sense. But what we can certainly say is that they don't have the authorities or the resources to do it today, and so the private sector is left to do it on their own. And so the question becomes, if that's the case, and we all agree that that's the case, what can the private sector do, and what can the government do to help the private sector defend the nation's cyberspace for real? One thing you might think about is that we might apply the idea of collective defense to private sector companies in cyberspace. We might say to companies, and companies might say to themselves, look, if I can't defend myself against the Russian nation state or the Chinese, maybe I might join hands with my colleagues in industry, whether that's JP Morgan or Citibank, and share information at machine speed in real time, the same way the actors are coming up against me to do this to defend myself. And maybe I'll do that not just in my own industry, but across industries, and maybe I'll even work with the government to get them information, see if they won't give me information back to defend myself, and maybe I can even convince my government to work with our allies to do that same thing so that we're not standing alone, right? One company is an island trying to defend itself against the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the North Koreans. So that might be one way to think about it, and something that Congress has already sort of provided some authorities to do. They provided broad authority in 2015 to share information. Of course, there are some challenges there. There still remains some liability issues in that law that was passed in 2015. There remain some regulatory issues. You might consider removing those barriers to sharing to the extent you believe those are barriers. And you might encourage the government to do more to collect against the threat to private industry using our national capabilities, our national technical means, both overhead and signals intelligence, and to take that information it collects and to first look for information about threats against the private sector, and then to share that information in real time with the private sector so private sector defense is empowered by government collection. We don't do that effectively today, in part because of source and methods concerns, and in part because we're not authorized nor do we have the mission to collect that information. So one might think that might be a valuable way to go too. And then finally, you might say that there's an important role for the government in defending the nation, at least in deterring this kind of nation-state activity. And so we know today that in the last year, using authorities provided by Congress, that the government's gotten more aggressive, engaging what it calls persistent engagement overseas, addressing and sort of active engagement with the enemy overseas. That's the right thing to do, defending forward. We might think that if we're going to use that capacity, capacity to defend the nation, right, that we might use that capacity to also defend our economy and defend the American private sector, being more aggressive, engaging persistently with the enemy overseas, defending our nation forward, not just when it comes to the government, but also when it comes to the private sector and our economy. The Trump administration is right to say that, and to say, frankly, what every other administration has believed but never said it directly, which is that economic security is national security. And so, look, there's a lot to be done in this space. The private sector has a role to play, in fact, a leading role to play, but the government can't sit by and watch it happen. They may need more authorities, they may need more funding. I think it's important that Congress think about that and provide clearer authority and responsibility to the private sector to take on this mission and wipe out the remaining vestiges of liability and potential regulatory authority the government might have to incentivize this positive activity. Then finally, with respect to structuring the government, in 2015, we did say that all of this has to go through DHS. DHS is still, moving forward and leaning forward, and it's got the right leadership to take the right steps. Still challenged when it comes to really dealing with the cybersecurity threat, and so one might, if the government were interested in doing it, might say we're going to broaden that aperture a little bit and let people share with who they want to share in the government, regardless of what part of the government they come from. So there are a few things that Congress might do here in the near future to move the ball forward down the line. So with that, back to you, Ken.
I could respond to some of that based on past experience, but I won't do it because you deserve to hear speakers of this quality and not me. Arthur Herman is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, the author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, How the Scots Invented the Modern World, in 2001. I was attracted to Arthur by the things that he's done on national security, and I won't list them all, but part of the idea of this panel is to bring forward innovative thinkers, and I regard Arthur as one of them. He's a frequent contributor to on defense, energy, and technology issues for Commentary Magazine, the New York Post, National Review, and the Wall Street Journal. He's also the first non-British citizen to be named to the Scottish Arts Council from 2007 to 2009, which is...
That's for a whole nother panel sometime. Thank you, Ken. Did I get the There we go. Thank you, Ken. What I'm going to talk about is quantum computers, quantum information science, and its implications for cybersecurity now and in the future. In your notes, if you want to sort of compartmentalize my discussion, you could call it, the subtitle might be The Reality of a Future Threat, the Need for Present Readiness. Quantum computers, really quickly, what makes them so special is the very physical nature of the technology, the science on which they're based, which is quantum mechanics. And the peculiar nature of quantum mechanics is that a quanta, a bit of energy, can be in 2 different states at once. And this is distinctly different from the way in which, for example, bits on a conventional computer work. They work in a linear sequence of 1s and 0s. And a bit in a conventional computer that you use for processing information can either be a 1 or it can be a 0. A qubit, in other words, using a subatomic particle as a means of conveying information or a bit of information, can be in not just 2 different states at once, but 4. It can be a 1 or a 0. It can be a 1 and a 0, or a 0 and a 1. 4 states out of 1 bit. And what this means is that you can do calculations much faster and more efficiently than a conventional computer can do. And the more qubits, the more quantum-based bits you add, your computing power soars exponentially. And this is why, as I explained in my Wall Street Journal piece from 2 weeks ago about why quantum computers are now a national security issue, this is why, for example, a quantum computer using 300 qubits has the equivalent computing power of can run the same number of states as all of the atoms in the observable universe. That's the power of exponential mathematics. That's the power of a future quantum computer that can be unleashed. Now, up until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, this was thought of as being an entirely scientific possibility, theoretical possibility, something to be explored in physics labs and classrooms, but certainly not something which would become an engineering issue to undertake. And that's begun to change. And I think the recent announcement that came from Google that it had, with its 63-bit qubit computer, achieved what was called quantum supremacy, namely its ability to solve a problem which would take a supercomputer years to solve, was able to do this in a matter of hours, was proof that this kind of quantum computer is not just a scientific possibility, but is now going to become, and increasingly, a reality. There are already quantum computers out there that you can use on the cloud. IBM has one. Microsoft has one. Rigetti Computing, which is a mid-sized firm, is going to establish one through AWS. But having that kind of computing power at your disposal means a lot of exciting things can happen. And the virtue of the quantum computers, there's 4 different types of problems that it can solve that classical computers, we call them classical computers now, like classical rock, right? As opposed to current. 4 different types of problems that it can solve that the classical computers, even the fastest supercomputers, struggle with or can't solve at all. First one are what are called optimization problems. And the best example of an optimization program is that you've got, let's say, 30 or 40 different points, geographic points, which you have to visit. What's the quickest way to visit them in sequence? And oddly enough, that's a problem that current computers have a real difficulty with and being able to solve. But because of the nature, the efficiency of a quantum computer, because it's not that it runs faster than a supercomputer, it just eliminates all these extra operations. As I like to say, and I said in one of my Wall Street Journal articles, it's like instead of having to read all the books in the Library of Congress one at a time, linear sequence, you can read them all at once. That's what a quantum computer can do. So optimization models, figuring out how to get to, if you have a delivery route, right? 30 different stops. What's the quickest way in which to complete my route? That'll solve that problem for you. The second type, which they're set up to do extremely, which they are able to accomplish very, very quickly, are examples in which you're looking at modeling of complex systems, particularly basic physics systems. So one of the things that quantum computers will be able to tackle are issues, for example, with regard to climate. The current climate models that are out there about climate change and so on are still very crude compared to the enormous complexity of everything that goes into understanding climate. Quantum computers will be able to approach those with much more accuracy and much more efficiency in the process. The second one is in pattern recognition. Pattern recognition, again, in large complex systems, which means that quantum computers will be used a lot for risk analysis, because you can sort through all kinds of different factors and find patterns in a very, very short period of time that, again, classical computers, even big data analysis finds challenging to do. They'll be able to solve that. So there'll be a lot of use for quantum computers in the future in, for example, financial industry, understanding risk analysis, and of course in the military too, and understanding what happens if you go to war with this country in these situations. What are all the possible factors that have to be brought in to understand it? A quantum computer will give you a lot of advantage to that. And then the fourth and in many ways the most notorious aspect of the quantum computer, and the other set of problems that will have great skill and efficiency in solving is factorizing the big prime numbers that underlie all of our public key encryption systems. And this is going to be a capacity that large-scale quantum computers of somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 qubits, will be able to undertake. And it will apply not just to RSA symmetric public key encryption systems, but also the asymmetric AES will also be vulnerable to intrusion by quantum computers of that size and of that scope. Now, how likely is it we're going to get to one of those, right? What's the timeline? Well, that's the big question, and that's the one that everyone's debating about. And I would say that the best estimates that I've heard is that we're looking at a time frame now of about 5 to 10 years. My colleague Michele Mosca at the Institute of Quantum Computing at the University of Waterloo up in Ontario, his calculations based on his survey in discussion with quantum scientists who are working in this area is that the odds of achieving a large-scale quantum computing, a code-breaking, in other words, code-breaker quantum computer by 2025 are about 1 in 7. 1 in 7. By 2030, the odds are looking more about even, about a 50% at that point. Now, that's what Michele thinks now. Talk to him in 2 years and see what he thinks, why the odds have changed. Because one of the things about quantum computing and the development and progress in this field is that everything has come faster than even the experts had anticipated. So let's say that accurate, though, that his estimate is about right. It's a 5 to 10 year window in which you begin to think about, well, then what are we going to do about our public key encryption systems as a whole? Even those, in the case of AES, that in many ways protect classified information, it's going to be a challenge with that. And of course, the real challenge with this is that you'll never know it's happened. Unlike conventional hacking attacks, which leave a footprint, right, or a fingerprint in the really good ones, there's no way of knowing this, because when it cracks that encryption system, it cracks it at the core. So it will seem to be part of the network. That's the whole point about this. So there's no way that you'll know that it's cracked into, for example, your bank account and that of the banking system until suddenly all your money's gone. You'll say, what happened? How did all this happen? There will be no backdoor. There will be no trace. There is no response to a quantum computer. Resiliency, that key word which now we talk a lot about in cybersecurity, doesn't apply with a quantum computer attack. There is no resiliency. Once it's done, it's done. It's over. So, given that fact, and given this possibility here, we can see why there is such a scramble to get to the first large-scale quantum computer, not just in this country, but also in the case of China. Now, China has now devoted enormous resources to that development of quantum computing. The Chinese government is spending somewhere between $10 to $12 billion in quantum technology as a whole, and I'll talk a little bit more about what else is there. But a primary focus is the development of a quantum computer. Also, Chinese private industry, companies like Alibaba and Baidu, are also devoting about $10 to $12 billion to the effort, having been encouraged by the government to think that this is a good idea, that you devote resources and some of your scientists in this area. So if the Chinese are able to achieve a quantum computer, you can see what the possibilities are from their perspective here. Think of it this way. Imagine the Chinese having access to all that data that Michelle was talking about that they've stolen out of OPM, right? And then having a second bite at the apple by going back into that data and cracking into the encrypted material, encrypted data that can be found and accessed by piecing together what they know from the first bite of the apple. And then also remember, too, that at the same time, that 5 to 10-year window applies to actually being able to decrypt all of that data and information. In the meantime, both the Chinese and the Russians are gathering encrypted data, collecting it, so that putting it in cold storage for the day when they do have their large quantum computer, and will be able to go through and sort through all of that other data retrospectively. It's a process we call data harvesting. And data harvesting is the reason why a long-term threat, a 5 to 10-year window, is actually illusory, because the data that we accumulate and the data that's taken and stolen and accessed now in 5 to 10 years will become vulnerable. And as we know, being able to read data retrospectively is hugely valuable, gives you a much bigger picture, big picture of what's happening, whether you're talking about government data, financial data, data with regard to any number of institutional functions that the Chinese would want to have access to and to be able to control in the process. So what to do about it? Well, there's two, as with any kind of defense, whether you're talking missile defense or cyber defense, the best approach, the approach which we're advocating at the Quantum Alliance Initiative, is a layered approach. The first layer being what is called, well, somewhat misleadingly actually, post-quantum cryptography. It's called post-quantum because it presupposes the existence of a quantum computer already, but it's actually cybersecurity measures that go in prior to the actual development of a quantum computer, to be installed now and developed now. Post-quantum cryptography is algorithmically based. It's basically creating and building algorithms which are large enough and complex enough to resist future quantum intrusion. We've got a number of companies and a number of institutions that are developing these right now. The NIST, for example, is engaged in a long-term contest to develop and arrive at the best quantum-resistant algorithms, or QRAs. And it's a process of sorting through and umpiring results that they think will be finished by 2024. That's their hope, that they'll have that done. And then the rollout after that will be, as the scientists there have told me, will be maybe about a 6 to 8 year process. Now you match that timeline against Michele Mosca's timeline of where we're going to be, the possibility by 2026 of a 1 in 7 chance for a quantum computer being up and running. And then the rollout from 2024 to 2032, when we're looking at 2 years after the 50 in 50 chance of a quantum computer. And you have to sort of wonder, well, you'd like to encourage NIST to speed up the process a little bit. But there are also, as I say, a number of companies that have developed these, as I talk about this in my Wall Street Journal article, which have already developed QRAs. They're not that, they're extremely complicated to do, but they are things that companies that are involved in software development and cybersecurity are able to do and have the skills to carry out. The next step, the final step with this, in terms of a layered defense, however, is actually using quantum technology directly in order to encrypt and protect data and networks. This is what's done through quantum random numbers generators. Since the quanta themselves are genuinely random, they're random by nature. They're not simply generated by a computer like current random number generators function. They're generated by nature itself, in conjunction with a key distribution system which randomly generates keys that are used by receiver and sender for the equivalent of a one-time pad, called key distribution networks. The quantum key distribution networks is hardware-based as opposed to software-based, but it will generate and can be used to create a network which is essentially hack-proof, even from quantum computers, let alone from classical computers here. Because once someone tries to intrude into the network, try to get in to find out what's happening there, the quanta disappear. They vanish from the scene. They can't stand to be looked at or measured or anything like that. So it breaks down, and both parties know it, so it's not going to happen. Now, at the mention of the word hack-proof, we find ourselves in Stewart Baker territory, which is the question of what is law enforcement going to do in confronting the possibility of, quote, hack-proof networks, at least theoretically so. Well, that's a whole nother debate that's going to come, but I'm going to predict to you that debate's going to come before those networks are deployed, and let's hope so. Because one of the advantages to dealing with quantum technology and the quantum computer threat, such as it is that we have, perhaps for the first time in the history of technology, the capability of law getting out ahead of the technology and government regulation, as opposed to, as usually happens, chasing it down the road. This is, I think, has been one of the problems that we faced with standard cybersecurity, is that the technology moves faster than law and regulation can. And I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that the standards by which to build cybersecurity measures have been sort of left to chance, left to incremental development, as opposed to being set and being organized ahead of time. With quanta, you have that possibility. You have the possibility to get out, to set standards for quantum random number generator, to set standards for quantum key distribution, to which commercial companies, labs can turn into commercial possibilities and enterprises in order to protect data and networks in the future. But what I'm going to suggest to you here at the end is that the future threat of quantum computers will demand a response sooner rather than later, both because of the complexity of the technology and the complexity of the countermeasures that are required. There are no silver bullets by which to deal with that kind of threat. But also because I think it is optimal in terms of being able to address a technology before it becomes deployed, before it becomes as disruptive as it potentially could be, as a way in which to understand this as the next frontier of where we go with cybersecurity and protecting our data and networks in the future.
Thank you very much. One of the problems of following the cyber issues is that you hear things that suggest to you that problems are being solved. I mean, it's not that we somehow we're disposed, I think, to look for solutions that will complicate some of the questions that we have. I remember back in 2013, I think it was an Obama administration executive order that created a set of recommendations for government and private sector cooperation. And this commission, I guess it was a commission, was given a year to come up with something useful. And what they came up with was simply recommendations recommendations for the private sector on how it should report cyber intrusions. And it was all form. And then at the same time, and I was about to give up at this point, but in 2014, excuse me, there were something like 16 identified infrastructure areas. I don't know if they were called that or not, but there was a sort of an informal notion that companies ought to report in, and then a year later, 2 years after that, something like only 3 areas of these 16 were cooperating with the government, and in each of those 3 areas, there were just a handful of private sector involvement. And so I thought, okay, this is it. It's not going to don't think about this anymore, think about something else. And then a couple years later, I ran into a guy from Los Alamos, and I mentioned this to Arthur before we started, who told me all about photon encryption. And he gave actually quite a convincing presentation. And I said, well, what happens next? He said, well, we'll put this out for the private sector to develop commercially. And nothing happened, and I could not find a single thing about it since then, except for what I've got from Arthur today. Let's just open this up, and if the panelists want to comment on one another, fine. If those of you in the audience wish to get your hand in here, please go right ahead.
You're right.
Question of fact. We're talking about Chinese government and business investment in quantum computing and American business investment in quantum computing, American and other Western government investment therein.
Oh, I didn't want to talk about that because the numbers are kind of embarrassing. We've stepped up very recently. The National Quantum Initiative Act, which was passed late last year and signed by the president, committed an additional $1.25 billion over 5 years for advancing quantum information science in a broad sense, and distributed out to Department of Commerce and NIST, the National Science Foundation, and also Department of Energy. Department of Energy is really where, in the federal government, that's one of the key hubs for quantum technology development and really furthering science. I wasn't at all surprised when I heard Ken's story about the fellow at Los Alamos Labs. That's one of the most important ones, and they're going to be the ones who are really going to take the money authorized and do some interesting things with it, I think, will be DOE. What's been missing has been a similar bill on the national security side. The Science Committee, by its nature, was to work on a bill that advanced science and technology. And it was very careful. When I was talking to them as the bill was taking shape, they said, you know, we love your ideas, Dr. Herman, but the fact is that if we start talking about the areas that I feel are really imperative here, right? National security, including cybersecurity. If we talk about international cooperation in terms of advancing that cybersecurity thing, they said, all the other committees will say, that's our turf. And suddenly the whole process becomes complicated. And they said it's going to be hard enough getting this bill through as it is without having to fight against Homeland Security, having to fight against commerce, et cetera, et cetera. And I understood exactly what they were getting at. So we're spending about that $1.25 billion over 5 years. By the way, that's about what the big private companies are spending on their quantum computing efforts. When you talk about Google, Intel, Microsoft, and who am I leaving out here? Google, Intel. Amazon has been getting into this field and also into the cybersecurity area too. But it's always important to remember that what they're doing is one small piece of their overall global business. They're investing in this as a future technology they'll be able to bring to their customers and clients going forward. They're not investing in this because it's a national security imperative. Now, in other areas, like for other parts of the government, some of the military labs, like the Air Force Research Lab, very hammer and tongs on this. Likewise, the Navy Research Lab, the Army Research Lab have been spending money and doing it. But again, they're taking chunks of money which goes to R&D generally and devoting it to quantum. There's no sort of dedicated fund directed or in this area. The most interesting example, though, is National Security Agency. They have a quantum computer they're building. We don't know very much about it. Those of us who aren't given classified access to what's taking place there. They're working on their own quantum-resistant algorithms, their own QRAs. But for various reasons, the National Security Agency has decided that quantum encryption photon encryption is not for them. They're not going to pursue that area. And it's interesting to think about why that has happened. And unfortunately, I think others have taken the cue from NSA in thinking that quantum random number generators and quantum key distribution is not really going to be a way in which to protect data in networks, when in fact it is. But I think that has more to do with the nature of NSA culture than it does with the actual scientific validity or probity of a quantum encryption, quantum cryptography approach to these kinds of things here. But by and large, as I said in my Wall Street Journal piece, China's outspending us right now about 10 to 1 in this area. Money doesn't always buy you everything when it comes to science and technology, but it doesn't hurt. Particularly when your best scientists have been trained at places like MIT, Caltech, right, Carnegie and Mellon, and you have access to all of that, all those great brains by secondhand as a result of that. So there you are.
Gentlemen, ladies?
You know, I mean, I agree with what Arthur has said. I think that I hadn't heard that NSA has decided not to pursue QKD. That would be surprising to me. And I think there are, you know, ongoing efforts, as you referred to, in the government to address, well, not to address, but to build capability to compute at those levels. Whether enough is being spent or not is, I think, a different question on the national security side. And because the budgets are largely classified, or the distribution of those budgets is largely classified, it's harder to know. But I do think that that you raised an interesting point about quantum, which is that, you know, like with a lot of technologies, where the technology gives with one hand or takes with one hand, it gives with the other. And so I am more sanguine about the problem presented by quantum computing for cryptography for the very reasons you cite, which is where quantum, you know, essentially destroys the capability of our current algorithms to function asymmetrically and symmetrically. It empowers essentially the old way of encryption, which is one-time pads, right? As long as both of you have the same methodology, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if somebody has the ability to break it, because only you know the secret, right? And if you can distribute that secret in a way that is quantum resistant or not detectable at all, right? Which is what QKD does. You don't need quantum cryptography, I don't think, and I defer to you on this, but I don't think you need quantum cryptography if you distribute through a QKD system, because you use a one-time pad that only you and the other person know. You distribute it using particles that are connected in that spooky way, as Albert Einstein referred to it. And so you've solved the problem because only you know the secrets. And so and quantum cryptography will help on top of that, but I don't think it's even necessarily necessary if you have a truly robust quantum key distribution system. Now the problem, which you, I think, correctly identify, is that the Chinese are way ahead of us. Right? The Chinese have at least purported, and whether it's true or not, purported to distribute keys through quantum key distribution using a satellite in outer space. You could debate whether that's real or not, right? Satellite. Yes, but certainly at least problematic if they're a lot further down that road than we are. And again, hard to know where we are in the classified space, but I am not optimistic, to be candid, on that front. And so I worry.
I agree with you, and that's one of the reasons why I push for the international cooperation, because many of our allies are further ahead.
I would step back as we're coming to a close here and offer a footnote on all of this, which is to say quantum computing is an example of a key technology capability that is going to have extraordinary significance for national security. And there are others, hypersonics and artificial intelligence, the list goes on, that need to be understood and need to be protected in ways that are going to ensure that we're not giving away the store to the extent we have made investments and are looking to those investments to advance our national security. And oh, by the way, from a counterintelligence perspective, I know that these investments in key technologies are areas where the Chinese, the Russians, and others are investing a lot of effort to try to get at what it is that we know in order that they can acquire these things to advantage. So all of these things it comes back to the need to have a strategic view and understand how the parts fit together, and to be able to orchestrate an overused phrase, but a whole of government response that engages what we need to engage in order to protect ourselves, to invest in the future, and to go forward with confidence.
Amen to that.
And if I can offer my last thoughts on this, if worse comes to worse, we could spend 25 years stealing Chinese commercial secrets, and they still wouldn't be caught up.
Okay. I'd like to thank the panel, and also something I neglected to do at the beginning, which was to thank the sponsorship of Representative Brendan Boyle, and also the help that I got from Carly Frame in his office. My intention going forward with this is to, if I can possibly do it, come up with material for 3 or 4 more sessions like this, and I may even be interested in generating papers from those sessions, and so we will see. But I'm delighted that this is being recorded, and the transcript, as I said, will be available, and the information about all this I will pass on to both the audience and to our panelists and their friends. So thank you very much again.
Thanks, Ken.